You see, what Biden doesn't seem to understand is when the government spends money for whatever economic stimulus programs it wants, there is a cost. When the government runs a deficit, when the government doesn't pay for spending through taxation, if we just run deficits and the Fed prints the money, well, then the programs are paid for through inflation. The public is going to pay for government one way or the other, either directly through an honest tax or indirectly through a dishonest tax called inflation. So if Biden wants to claim credit for all this government spending, then he has to claim responsibility for all the inflation that was required to finance it. He can't pretend that he gave taxpayers all this great stuff, but then inflation came and stole it away from them. The inflation came from government. The government stole it. What the government gives with one hand, it takes with the other. So Biden, through the government spending programs, with one hand, reached out and gave taxpayers some money, and then with the other hand, he's picked their back pocket through inflation to pay for it. So you can't say, I love all this government spending, but then pretend that the inflation that was a consequence of that government spending had absolutely nothing to do with that inflation. And that's why Biden is now trying to blame the inflation that he claims is robbing the taxpayers of all the good stuff that he's doing. He wants to blame it on greedy businesses, on businesses that are gouging their customers. It's the government, it's the Federal Reserve that's gouging businesses and consumers with inflation. But Biden is acting as if it's the free market. We don't have enough competition. We have too few companies. We got 4 companies that process beef, and supposedly all of a sudden they're colluding to drive up prices and they're gouging their customers. They're taking advantage of them. And Biden claims that the way he wants to fight inflation is by creating more competition and by lowering costs, which is so ridiculous because, first of all, one of the reasons that we don't have more competition is because of government. Government makes it harder for companies to survive and compete with other companies. All the regulations and all the taxes limit competition. So if you want more competition, we need less government, not more government. But the idea that the government is going to drive down costs, the government doesn't drive costs down, it drives costs up. Everything the government does increases the cost of business. I mean, any money the government spends has to be paid for by the private sector. So if Biden actually wants to reduce costs, he has to lower taxes. He can cut regulations because what government does with taxes and regulations is drive up costs. The only way they can bring those costs back down is to stop driving them up. So if they can lower the taxes that they've already imposed on businesses, if they can eliminate some of the regulations that they have already forced companies to comply with, then they could lower costs because the compliance costs of all those regulations, taxes that businesses are paying, they are passing those costs on to consumers. The one cost, though, that Biden doesn't seem to recognize is wages. Biden in his speech actually said that there are some people who want to fight inflation by driving down wages. Biden says, no, I don't want wages to go down. I want costs to go down. Well, what does he think wages are? Wages are a cost. They're the cost of labor. If you're a business, one of your costs is the wages that you pay your workers. So you can't talk about driving down costs and then leave wages off the table when wages are a big cost. I mean, the only way you can have higher wages and not have higher costs is if your workers are more productive. You can pay workers more if their productivity increases, but the government is not going to increase worker productivity. Everything the government does makes workers less productive. That's the problem. Biden acted as if the secret to driving down costs and having a more efficient economy is to make the government bigger and have the government spend more money. All that's going to do is make the economy less competitive. It's going to drive down productivity and drive costs up further.